In recent years, there has been a significant resurgence of interest, both for good and for bad, in what is known as the literary Western canon. Now, if you want to expand your reading, you want to get a deeper appreciation of literature, especially of the West, then some kind of engagement and understanding of the Western canon is going to be so beneficial. One thing is for sure, a closer familiarity with the Western canon will make you much more aware of why the Western world behaves like it does, how the Western world has influenced the rest of the world, how the history of the West has been shaped by its stories and by its history into creating an identity for itself. And if you were born in the West, maybe most importantly of all, why you even think the way that you do. But in this video, what we want to look at is what exactly is meant by the Western canon. How do works get into the Western canon? Maybe an example of a few of the great works within the Western canon. And then this is a big question. Who decides what is in the Western canon? I assure you that the answers are both very interesting and very edifying. So let's take a closer look, shall we? The first and most obvious question we have to ask ourselves is, what do we mean by the Western canon? If you were asked to describe what the Western canon is, what would you say? Well, we just need to break down the words. First of all, the word canon. Canon is an ancient Greek word that simply means measuring rod or standard. The ancient Greeks, who loved the arts, and for them the arts included mathematics and philosophy and science and religion, but they used to like ranking the relative brilliance of works against each other, and they had a criteria for doing so. And of course, those that were considered really substantial examples of artistry or truthful representation of nature, these become the standard, the canon, by which to measure other works. In fact, they went further. They were so interested in getting the best of everything that they had a word for certain works which basically meant admitted. Now, admitted to what? It meant they were admitted to the Great Museum. Now, you've heard of the Great Library of Alexandria, one of the ancient wonders of the world. That was part of a bigger complex called the Great Museum. And if a book was deemed very, very valuable, very brilliant, very insightful and intelligent, it might pass into being admitted to the Great Museum. It's like the greatest examples of its kind in literature. Today, we still use the word when we gather the most important artifacts or works of art into a museum. If you go to an art museum, you don't expect to find just any bit of scribbling or something from an online shop that was just made in someone's kitchen. You expect in a museum the finest examples of art. And the Greeks used that word, admitted, for its literature. Now, in the 2nd century AD, there was another writer, Latin writer, called Aulus Gellius, and he made the comment about some works, classicus descriptor non proletarius. That means a distinguished writer, not a commonplace writer. Now, when he said that, he was following that tradition of ranking works of literature, of art, of philosophy, of mathematics against each other, and that there are some which are far more distinguished. Now, when he says distinguished, he means that they're worthy of imitation, they're worthy of serious contemplation, more so than other works around them. Now, you may notice that in that word, that word distinguished was classicus. Well, guess what word we have for books today? Classics. Now, so we don't get sidetracked, we'll just say this. Not all classic books are part of the Western canon, but any books in the Western canon would be classics because they have to be distinguished. They are the measuring, the canon, the measuring stick by which all other works are compared. They are exemplary in doing what they do, whether in thought or in execution of ideas. So a canon then is that catalogue of works which are the most exemplary of whatever subject is under discussion. And from that you should immediately recognise that the Western canon is just one of many, many canons. You can have a canon for practically anything. If you were to make a canon of mathematics or science, you're going to have in there Euclid, you're going to have Pythagoras, you're going to have Newton. If you wanted to make a canon of the Christian God's inspired word to mankind, well, you're going to have the Bible, because that's what it claims to be. 66 books which are all claimed to be divinely inspired. It's known as the biblical canon. They're the standards to judge everything else by. What you wouldn't expect in either of those canons, scientific or religious, you wouldn't expect Lord of the Rings. You wouldn't expect Karl Marx's manifesto. So, a canon is that. What do we mean by the Western canon? The Western canon is that corpus of essential literary works which have exerted such force that they've wrought, shaped and forged a set of beliefs broadly shared by the European and English-speaking nations, that they constitute Western civilization's understanding of itself, the world and reality. But how does a work get into the Western canon? Can I just say, if you're enjoying this video, could you take the time to just press the like button, because it takes 1 second for you and does so much for my channel and for this video being promoted elsewhere. Thank you. The actual answer to how any kind of work gets into the Western canon is a really fascinating topic. And we're going to take a quick look at 4 possible criteria that works may have in order to get into the Western canon. But 3 of them may be true, but not in every case. Only 1, it could be argued, is actually essential for a work to get into the Western canon. But before we just look at those 4 things, we just have to get rid of an erroneous idea that some may have. Some may think that there are people who judge what goes into the Western canon, that there is a particular criteria a work has to pass through, that there are actually ordained arbiters of the Western canon that say this is most exemplary, this is not. None of that is true. The Western canon doesn't have a committee, an oversight board. Works have entered into it through history, not by being declared admissible like the ancient Greeks to the museum, but just because of their enduring effect. And it's really important to understand that, because you get some false ideas out there that certain academics or people in power impose the Western canon in order to tell us what to think. Nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, there's many works in the Western canon which I'm sure the people in charge would prefer weren't in the Western canon. So what does get works in there? Well, we'll look at the first 3 examples first, and then we'll spend a bit more time on the most important 4th point. Perhaps the least controversial of the first 3 points is longevity. So works that are in the Western canon have a certain length of time that they've been around. And the reason you'll find this with works in the Western canon is because if they've survived a long time, they repeatedly have shown that they appeal to people in the West. That people who read them recognise something about themselves in it, or they recognise what they hold to be a certain truth, and so they gain satisfaction from it. Now, alternatively, they can be of longevity because what they have done is represent truth. So for instance, you think of Euclid's rules on geometry. You know, he didn't solve everything, but what he did talk about is true in mathematics. So of course they're going to last, and you could put that in the world canon in that regards. So longevity would be a mark of a book that is in the canon. But you couldn't say it's a criterion to get into. It just happens to be something you would notice about works in the Western canon, that they have longevity. Could I just briefly interrupt this video to give you a word from my sponsors, which is you, the viewer. If you're enjoying this kind of content and want to see more of it and appreciate the effort that goes into making it, and you would like to contribute a little bit to support my channel, then consider going over to my Patreon community where you can get exclusive access, or if you just want to make a small £3 donation, you can go to my Buy Me a Coffee page and give a £3 donation there. Everything you do is so appreciated and helps me keep going. The links will be down below. Thank you ever so much for your support. Now, back to our video. A second element that can put a work into the Western canon is arguably originality. And this is not going to be accepted by everyone who thinks on this subject because, as I said before, there are no ordained arbiters of what goes in and what doesn't. This is just looking at works and noticing things about them that are in the canon. And originality is one of them because most works, most literature, is unoriginal in that it's built off the back of other things. So if you have the Marvel heroes today, that's not some original idea because you can go back for a long time and find heroes throughout. You look at the story of the Titanic, as in the film, with Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet, well, it's just a remake of Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. But when someone does come up with something original, that can have a dramatic effect on a civilization because other people read it and it sets their imagination going. And then thoughts, a whole doorway to a new way of thinking can be opened. So you think of Plato's Republic, a different way of thinking about government, which has a serious effect. You think of maybe The Castle of Otranto or The Italian, so by Horace Walpole or Anne Radcliffe. They're the books right at the beginning of the Gothic genre in literature. Now, before that, had there been worrying ghost stories and the like? Yes, but the Gothic was born out of a certain style, the Romantic period. And these are the books that you could argue they're not the best books, but they did open a door for writers to start exploring something else. Of course, the Gothic movement took off and other things came out of it, like murder mysteries, for instance. And so some could argue that a work like The Castle of Otranto or The Italian could go into the Western canon because of its long-lasting effect on subsequent writers, introducing an idea of seeing the world. The same would be true of whoever wrote the first science fiction or space exploration, those kind of things. They opened a world up, or fantasy. They opened a world up which maybe hitherto had not been noticed by the majority, and so spawned an exploration of the human mind, which became part of the culture over time. So that's one thing that could be said that could get a book into the Western canon. Again, this could be argued, and that's why I say the first three may be true, but they may not be essential. A third reason a book may enter into the Western canon is excellence in its field. So that could be excellence in argumentation, say through philosophy. It could be excellence in artistry and execution, say in fiction, playwriting, all that kind of stuff. So an example of how this could work would be Shakespeare. You could argue that Shakespeare doesn't tick the category of originality. In fact, the majority of works in the Western canon won't be the most original, but Shakespeare was notorious for borrowing his stories from elsewhere. Why does he get in the Western canon? Because of his sheer excellence of execution. And of course, he's had longevity, which demonstrates this. So many great writers, great thinkers, great speakers, great statesmen have lauded Shakespeare's ability to capture the human spirit, so that he goes into the canon. It becomes a measuring rod for other works to be held against. You see how that works? And that can also be in excellence of formulating an idea, where you get a fair amount of philosophers will come in. So you think of Plato, you think of Aristotle, the excellence of his forms of debate and arguing and reasoning. Here's what's interesting. A lot of people say that most of Aristotle's ideas are defunct now. But they were so well reasoned, so well argued, that they entered into the discourse of the Western civilization and have influenced things and influenced them to this day. And you can look at many other people. You can look at Freud, who maybe you could argue phrases himself quite well and is also quite original. So do you see how these three things go together? But not every item needs to have longevity, originality, and excellence. We just mentioned the Castle of Otranto and Radcliffe the Italian. Are they excellent works of literature? No. Are they original? Yes. And so some would put them into the canon for that reason. Others are in there for their sheer brilliance, like Dickens when it comes to social novels. You may not personally like him, but he's excellent in what he does. Now we come to the fourth element, and I would argue maybe the only element that is essential for including something in the Western canon or any canon, and that is influence. How much influence does a work have over subsequent works? How often can you trace works back to this particular work? The more a work influences later works, the more its effect on a civilization, a culture, a people's way of understanding themselves. Now, obviously, in the realm of the sciences, things that become established as fact and repeatable, such as Euclid's geometry and Newton's Principia, obviously other works are built on that. And that's like standing on the shoulders of giants. Someone comes up with this great breakthrough, and then others see the value of it and build upon it and build upon it. And it becomes the psyche of that culture. Obviously, it makes more sense in science, but it happens in the arts. And the arts are a representation of reality for a culture. And so when we talk about the Western canon, we're talking about what works have influenced the way the West as a whole has begun to perceive the world and develop its morals and its societal norms. So an example of this would be Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. There they are, some of the maybe the oldest record of Western influence. They create an identity for the Greeks. They give the idea of what the hero should be. Today, Marvel characters are not some new invention. They harken back to the ancient Greeks, the Iliad and the Odyssey. Most of the West's attitude to the warrior type, to what it means to be a man, can be traced back to these things because other works were built off it. An example, Virgil's great work, the Aeneid, which is the story of Aeneas, comes from where? It comes directly out of the Iliad. Aeneas is in that war between the Greeks and the Trojans. Aeneas has to make his way over to home, Latium and Rome. He recapitulates some of the events that are in the Odyssey. You see, what's Virgil doing? He realizes the brilliance of this heroic epic, how it's established an identity for the Greeks. And so he sees its value and takes it and tries to make it Roman. That's influence, isn't it? The Iliad has influenced Virgil. And so it goes from there. And then you get other stories that build up around the Iliad and the stories of the great, Odysseus and what's his face, Achilles. You have that. But go forward, even Dante's Inferno. How much reference is there to Greek mythology in that? Virgil is the guide in that. Do you see how things are growing out of each other? But it's not just there. Some would say, why is Shakespeare relevant today? Practically, the West's entire understanding of love, and I am simplifying, so don't jump on me, comes back to Romeo and Juliet. Shakespeare's work, Romeo and Juliet, is really the most excellently captured example of love where two people love each other from the heart and defy all other odds to be with each other. It never always used to be like that. You go back and you've got the troubadours, okay, and stories from the court of Navarre. And the way of love was for a knight to see someone above his rank. So you think the Arthurian legend of Guinevere and Sir Lancelot, it's a forbidden love, and he will do great acts and works in her name. And interestingly, for the troubadours, the queen or the princess may not even know the knight likes her. But we, the reader, do, and that's true love, that's true nobility. But they never get together because the status is a problem. You get the Plutarchan poets, which are like this. It's a love where you do wonderful things and suffer immensely on behalf of a woman who may not even know you exist. And then Shakespeare comes along. And we find Romeo is in that kind of troubadourian love at the beginning with Rosalind, whom, as far as we know as readers, Rosalind doesn't even know Romeo likes her, but he's mooning around. Eventually he meets Juliet, and then all family ties, societal ties, everything are broken because this true love, heart-to-heart desire to be with a person is what matters, is what the human fire is. That breaks the mould, and I won't say it's original because he borrowed the idea, but he did it so excellently that it's been repeated ever since, and it's become the way the West thinks about love. If you're in the West, you think that's the only way to think about love and marriage. Read other cultures and you'll realise that it's not, until they come in contact with the West and either adopt it or don't adopt it. That's what makes an essential work. That's what gets something into the canon, because it influences all the writing afterwards. Don Quixote is the same. Isn't Don Quixote really mocking that old romantic style of love? Dulcinea doesn't even know that he's out doing all these works for him. He's making fun of the romantic ideals. And that opened the door, and not only that, it opened the door to the story, as in the novel, the way we see it today. What a breakthrough. So that, you would argue, has to go into the Western canon for its sheer influence. But, and here's a massive thing which we're going to mention in the next bit of this video. You can't get, even with that, a definitive canon. And that's why there's no ordained arbiters. You can't say this is the Western canon. Harold Bloom, who wrote the book which really inspired interest about the Western canon, is said to have regretted that he put a catalogue of books, he made his own Western canon, and you can find it on Goodreads and around the internet. It's over 1,000 books. He regretted it because you can't strictly do it. For instance, overall, if you picked a British person to write the Western canon, what goes in it, it would probably have more British books than, say, a French cataloguer would have, because obviously the West is a broad culture, but within it are smaller national cultures. A Russian making the Western canon would put more Russian works in, probably. So this is where a little bit of a quandary comes up. So how do you identify the Western canon? Well, a lot of it is your own choice, but the criteria we've looked at helps. I would say the fourth criteria is the biggest one, and maybe even the only, maybe excellence is the only one that you have to look at. And now we're just going to go on and look at a couple of books from the Western canon, which I would argue every person would have, and this is not exhaustive, every writer of a Western canon would put in. So what are some of the works that are pretty much rock steady in the Western canon? Again, the way to judge this is by their sheer influence on the culture of the Western civilization. The way it identifies itself, the way it runs its governments, all those kind of things. Different people are going to pick different books in an overall canon, but some are likely to be in every canon. Top amongst those is the Bible. Now, this is not a case of saying the Bible is God's word or it's not God's word, whether it's fact or fiction. So please don't argue below. This is about the sheer influence a work has over subsequent works. You look at how governments are run across Europe, you look at the influences of churches through Europe. Where does it all stem from? It stems from the Bible. Did this book have huge influence over all of Western Europe, whether Orthodox or Catholic or Protestant? Without a shadow of a doubt. Has it spawned works of art? Has it spawned other stories? Are other stories written as, rehashes of biblical stories? Of course they are. It is probably, without a doubt, the most influential book. And so it goes into the Western canon. A lack of understanding of the Bible and its standards and all that will equal a lack of understanding of the West and how it got to where it is. Along with that, now if someone left that out because they were atheists, that would just show sheer bias. In the same way as another book. If someone who was a fundamentalist Christian decided to leave out The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin, that would show a bias, because that book, you would have to argue, has to go in the Western canon for its sheer influence over the West's understanding and how it's moved forward. It's had a huge effect. Another example of where there shouldn't be any biases would be, for example, Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, which sort of tries to explain capitalism. An extraordinarily influential book on the way the growing industrialized nations saw capital and industry and how to make wealth and etc., etc. And that was built off other things. But say someone hates capitalism and they decide they're going to leave it out. That's an erroneous Western canon, because you're not talking about whether you agree with the book, but its sheer influence on subsequent ideas and works. Any more than a person who is major capitalist and anti-socialist, if they decided I'm not putting Marx into the Western canon, would again be very biased. Those books have massively influenced the world. In literature, and I would argue literature in some respects, more than anything else, the stories we tell ourselves shapes our identity. So, Homer, with the Iliad and the Odyssey, you can't get away from that being in the Western canon. It's just there. Because it's right at the root of all the epics, of all the stories we begin to tell ourselves. Virgil would also be in that list. You would argue Dante. I did a video recently about books which I would say are essential to the Western canon. Dante's Divine Comedy influenced so much of the thought of Europe because of the role of the Bible and being God-centric, as it were. That's how we were formed, and you can't get away from some of the ideas, traditions, inherited feelings, morality. No matter how you feel about these works, we and you are influenced by them. Because we've inherited this huge centuries-long heritage that we don't even understand the impact ourselves. There are other great works amongst the philosophers. For instance, the French would have a lot there. The Germans have a lot there. Amongst novels, you would definitely have War and Peace and Anna Karenina. So Tolstoy, Dostoevsky would land in that. The great Russian tradition really affected the way of psychology coming into art and the importance of the inner turmoil and awareness of that whole new inner landscape. Dickens, now someone could argue that one, but I don't think many would. The social novel was such a powerful use of the social novel. I would put, maybe it's because I'm British, Robinson Crusoe, because you think of all the Crusades, or the Robinsonades as they're called, like Swiss Family Robinson, people trapped on islands. That comes from that idea, a bit of originality, and also called the first English novel. Some English novels are going to be more dominant, and there's a simple reason, not because they're better, but it's because the British eventually, they formed America, albeit accidentally by a revolution. But who's the most influential nation on the way we perceive entertainment and tell stories? It's Hollywood, isn't it? And a lot of that's inherited from the British writing. However, not exclusively, of course. Flaubert is going to be massive in that. Flaubert's use of free indirect speech and his understanding and forming of realism is influenced everything in Europe. And so he's going to be inside the canon. You could say perhaps the same with Austin. Certainly Goethe from Germany, definitely going to be in there. So there's quite a number. I'm not going to nail down every single one, but I would say the ones I've mentioned there are probably amongst those that are not controversial. Because I'm just going by the sheer influence on subsequent works, on subsequent artists, on subsequent thinkers. So Nietzsche is going to be in there, isn't he? Freud is going to be in there, whether you think he got everything wrong or not. His influence is still felt today. That makes the Western canon. Now we have one last little question, and it's going to sound contradictory to something I said before. This question is, who really decides what gets into the Western canon? Because I did say there are no ordained arbiters picking what goes in the Western canon. However, there are ultimately people who do decide in a roundabout way what gets into the Western canon, and we'll just briefly mention that as our last point in understanding the literary Western canon. So who decides what gets into the literary Western canon? I've heard many, some have even left comments on old videos of mine, not to do with the Western canon, but they've said that the Western canon is framed by people who are in power, who are trying to develop a teaching system to make people believe X, Y, Z. Now, do people in power maybe want to influence what books we read and what ideas are acceptable? Sure, that's been the same for every civilization through all of history. However, the canon has longevity and ruling powers change. What makes a canon anywhere is they become the essential works that are recognizable. They keep that longevity where people recognize, yes, I agree with this. This represents things accurately. This is true. This is who we are. This is what reality is. And no matter how temporary governments or temporary fads and trends come up and try to push civilization in a way, they'll always go the same direction, which is backwards into the past. Yet the canonical works tend to remain and push through it. They may be lost for a generation, but they re-emerge. How does that happen? Who is it that's keeping them on track? The answer is quite simple. There's two primary characters that keep these things in front of us. And one of them is more important than all the others. Now, on the literary level, it's writers. Writers ultimately decide what goes into the canon, because writers are inspired from what they read before. They build out of former ideas. They stand on the shoulders of giants. Look at Virgil. He copied the Iliad, but changed it for his nation. If you look at Dante, he copies the myths of Greece and Christianity, the stories of the Bible, to create an idea. So he's built out of those. That keeps the effect of the Bible and the Greeks going. If you look at Shakespeare and Romeo and Juliet, which we picked, or his tragedies, for instance, which have then inspired so many more understandings of the internal nature of our dilemmas, other artists are inspired and build off that. It raises awareness. It makes flashes of light, which another author will pick up on and say, I want to expand on that idea, and it builds. And so books come out of other books, out of other books, out of other books. Writers end up finding that there are particularly excellent works which they go back to, particularly insightful works, and they become influential. And you can trace so much back to these works. They're the ones that form the canon. But the reason they got into the canon is because other writers built off them. Now, there is another category of people, and that is the avid reader. Avid readers also influence the Western canon. And by avid readers, I'm talking close readers. They may be academic, they may not be. So the academics do have a big influence because they've studied literature, for instance, and come to appreciate form, technique, style, excellence They are more adept at using a canon in saying, okay, how does this work match up to previous works which talk about the same subject? How does this work match up to the way it brings forth the emotions, the way it explains? And they get a deep insight into form, which comes from the Greeks, really, and the Renaissance, the perfection of something. And they recognize that there are works which are just significantly better executed. Now, because they're good readers, they may not be writers, they present these to their students and say, this is excellent. We don't want to show you what's rubbish. We want you to build upon what is excellent. And those readers will always be through time. And they will find books that trends may have got rid of and say, wow, we've lost this because it wasn't in vogue. We need to reintroduce it because it's so brilliantly done. And that's why sometimes you'll find in the halls of academia, certain books stay for a long time. Now, in the halls of academia, because politics is the universal acid that gets in everything, that's why you'll get moments in history where a trend will eradicate. Academics won't want to talk about certain things. But over time, great readers will find what's brilliant and bring it back up. But primarily, it's the writers that do it. Books are born from other books. Originality is extraordinarily rare. Now, there are others. If we're going outside of the realm of just fiction, then obviously certain scientific works are going to be built on. You know, with the theory of gravity, a lot of stuff follows. Was it perfect? Could there be refinements? Of course. But still, Newton's ideas work in a Newtonian sense. And so much has come out of that. And had he not done that, would we be where we are? You know, works are built upon other works. And that's how you get a canon. So if you really want to understand the Western civilization, the overall Western world and its attitude, find a bunch of Western canons that have been written by some very well-read people and find the ones that are across all of them. So like I say, the Bible will be across all of them. Homer and Virgil is going to be across all of them. In fact, a lot of the Greeks are going to be on all of them. Shakespeare will be on a lot, but maybe not all, although I find it hard to see why. Don Quixote will probably be on there as well. Flaubert certainly will be, if we're talking the arts. If you read those ones and think about them, you'll get a bigger understanding of, oh, this is how it's, especially if you do research, I see how this is traced to where we are today. And the things we think today are born from them. The biggest mistake with people who are disconnected from previous works, and I'm not saying everyone has to be into literature, you don't. Nor music, nor art. You can be into the sciences, you can be into bird watching, stamp collecting, anything you like. But one thing about a wide lack of understanding of previous cultural works is that a group of people think they're doing something new when they may actually be doing something that a long time ago was tried and found faulty. Okay? Or they may think their ideas are brand new, only to realise the reason you thought that way in the first place was because of centuries worth of thinking in that way. So it's a very valuable thing to get down to the nitty-gritty. But of course, it's not the topic for everyone, and you don't have to be interested in it. But if you are, and you particularly the arts and literature, then go down and find those books that are in the canon. Alternatively, I hope you've learned from this video that if you wanted to go into Eastern culture, find its canon. It will have its own essential works that have influenced later works repeatedly, which has cultivated a certain outlook. If you get familiar with those works, you'll have a quicker entry into a culture, and every culture has them, to the point that you have the Western canon, but the Western canon is not the Italian canon. The Italians will have their own canon that makes the Italian identity. The same with the Swedish canon and the British canon and the Spanish and the Portuguese. Anywhere you go in the world will have its own canon, whether it's written down or whether it's the oral traditions and oral stories. I hope you've enjoyed this video about the Western canon, what it is, and how it's constructed and what it's not. It's not a claim that it's the only corpus of works. It's just the works that made the West's identity. And also, I hope that you maybe got an idea of, if there's a particular avenue you want to explore, how to go about finding the best works to read first. As always, if you've enjoyed the video, hit the like button, don't forget to subscribe, and until the next time, I will wish you joy in whatever you read.